Hello, everybody. As Warren said, I'm Raul Gutierrez, founder CEO of Tinybop. I was late last night, and I was supposed to talk about, or be on the panel, we were talking about the state of digital right now. So very quickly, like for a lot of kids, like this is kind of a range of the digital world. Like Baby Shark. Baby Shark was worth $42 million before the creator of Baby Shark, which was sort of an accident. I think once you get out of the parents controlling the kids' world, a lot of kids like instantly go to TikTok, which TikTok is not really built for younger kids. There's a lot of content that's not appropriate for younger kids, I don't think, but that's where they're going to. Obviously, Minecraft. Minecraft, I think, is fading a little bit in the sort of, obviously it's still a huge phenomenon, but if you hang out with fifth graders and sixth graders, it doesn't have the sort of power it did a couple of years ago. A lot of that has been replaced with Fortnite, but even Fortnite, which is still sort of this gigantic phenomenon, is fading a little bit. Again, if you hang out with a lot of middle schoolers, like a year ago, every single one of them was playing Fortnite pretty obsessively, and that started to fade. I think kids right now, they're getting Instagram younger and younger, and then a lot of those kids, as they get sort of a little older, transition to Snapchat. And it's just this very kind of disjointed market, not really a lot of place for smaller companies like us. Like these are giant companies. I think in the kids space, a lot of what we're seeing are where a lot of the money is going to subscription type companies. Epic is one. They offer a ton of books. Learn with Homer. Those companies, we know a little bit about them. Some of our former employees were hired by those guys. So a lot of those companies are spending a huge amount of money on advertising, and then they're building this subscription base. But the margins are actually very thin. They're spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on advertising to make slightly more than that in subscription to sort of build, these bases. Anyway, that's my sort of brief overview of the market. I think the other sort of big thing in the kids space right now is there's a lot of anxiety because of our politics. I think a lot of kids feel that from adults, and whether you're on this half of the side of people that think that the president is the second coming, or this side, there is if you talk to kids, they feel sort of anxious about the world. And I would say sort of the other half of that are people like Greta Thunberg and climate change. Like there's this underlying anxiety that we see kids talking about and expressing very vividly, with almost like a kind of nihilism. 5 years ago, when we talked to fifth graders and sixth graders, very few of them would say, well, it doesn't really matter when I'm 20, because the world's going to be, on fire. But you hear that a lot now, and it's kind of a scary time, I think. We at Tinybop are trying to do something that I think is hard, and it's hard to do in this environment. We're this creative studio. I think this is our mission statement, that we design playful experiences to inspire creativity, curiosity, and a love of learning. But it's very hard for us to get our products out there in this world that we're living in, because of the way the platforms have such control over the distribution of software. I think we've managed to make a business that's sort of meaningful and sustainable, but it's definitely tough work. I think the last time I talked to you, we were just sort of Tinybop making apps. Now, a big part of what we do is something called Tinybop Schools, which takes our app content, puts it on the web, and packages it. for schools. We've been around since 2012. We have tens of millions of apps that are out there. The vast majority of our apps are paid. It's a business model that I wouldn't recommend starting right now. It's a pure paid app. We don't have in-app purchases. We don't have subscription. Well, we do have a subscription on Android, but that's a very minor part of our business. They're just pure paid apps. And so that means that, when we talk about lifetime value of the customer, we're looking for people to come to us as a brand. So we want somebody to buy an app, have a really good experience, and then buy another one. And that's pretty much worked. The majority of our income comes from bundle sales of people that they buy one app and then they sort of ultimately go to a bundle and buy a bundle for $20. The bundles, it's a very hard sort of customer acquisition strategy, but it's stable enough for us and it's predictable enough that it sustains our core team. We build apps in series. Some of this, for those of you guys who've been here year after year, have probably seen some of this, but for those of you who don't know us, I'll sort of explain it. Our first series, Explores Library, is designed to sort of explain the world, the physical world, to kids. They were inspired by instructional posters, children's encyclopedias, like classroom models. We have 11 apps in this series. Each one covers like a big subject that we think is universal, that's applicable to kids everywhere. Each of these apps is in 40 plus languages. So it means that when we sell, we're selling everywhere. The U.S. is probably, like at this point, like 30% of the business for apps. Part of our job is to make it beautiful. All these apps are about revealing the invisible, exposing systems that that kids can't see, making connections, and they're mainly wordless. We do have labels, but we don't have instructional text. We don't have sort of guides. They're really sort of the discovery apps. This is our Coral Reef app, and this is the kid's favorite scene in the Coral Reef app, where the shark dies gets eaten by the starfish. If we have a formula for these apps, it's each app is a simulation. The learning is embedded in the interaction, and the output is a kid asking questions. So our goal here is to have kids curious about the subject and hopefully going to a book or going to an adult to learn more. And so, for example, in this one, we never say that the skeleton is holding up the human body, but if a kid pulls away the spine, the skeleton falls apart. So the learning is embedded in that interaction. Basically, all of these apps are this just a series of like little physics simulations that do exactly this, whether it's the water cycle or a volcano, and so on. Second series is called Digital Toys, and digital toys are construction kits. They basically allow kids to give form to their imagination within sort of a certain context, and then bring their creations to life. So in this series, we have 6 apps. The Robot Factory was the first. That one was Apple's App of the Year a couple years ago. We have one that lets kids make monsters, one that lets them make their own video games, one that lets them construct little versions of themselves. The Creature Garden, they make fantastical creatures. And again, the idea is that we're giving kids just enough to jump off on and tell their own stories. So this is our Creature Garden. Kids can create, creatures, and then we bring them to life. But it's really we don't do that much more with them. We just allow the kids to sort of animate them and make them real, name them. And our formula in these apps is that we have a construction set. It's child's imagination kind of let's put them together. And the output, the thing that we test for when we're doing playtesting is, does the kid have a story about what we've created? That's something that we didn't imagine. So, you know, if you watch kids play the Robot Factory, every robot is sort of like, it's either a friend or it's sort of like a perfect version of themselves or a superhero. And if you ask kids about them, they'll say, well, you know, my robot, he helps my mom. Because, you know, my mom, my dad left, my mom needs a lot of help, and that's what my robot is. Or they'll say, you know, my robot looks just like me, except that, you know, it's better somehow. So that's our digital toy series. Tinybop Schools is relatively new. We found that teachers were some of our best advocates. We had over 2 million apps that have been downloaded in the schools, but they're coming in one by one. And teachers were often just buying them themselves and putting them on iPads. And that's a terrible way to sell to schools. And so we talked to a lot of teachers and went to a lot of schools. What we found is that most schools don't have iPads. Most schools have Chromebooks as sort of a base. And we needed to sort of go backwards and put our content on the web if we wanted to be successful. We also needed to have more teacher support, and especially around open play. It's really difficult in the classroom. If you have sort of a, you know, an open play earth where kids can trigger volcanoes and make earthquakes and, you know, go to the bottom of the sea. If the teacher's teaching a specific subject, you know, erosion and deposition, it's hard to corral kids into the right space there. And so Tinybop Schools, you know, it's the same content, but it's on the web, and we have teacher support, and we have guiding questions and a few things that you know that have been asked for by teachers around the world. And so our sort of the thing that we've come up with in classrooms, we're not doing curriculum, we're not teaching curriculum, but, you know, obviously we do want kids to learn. So the question is, you know, they start with questions, they're inquiring, they're exploring. We ask kids to document what they found, they share it with the teacher, and then they draw conclusions. And so Tinybop Schools is a big part of our future. But our content still starts with apps, and now it gets funneled into schools. But the schools is sort of guiding the content a little bit right now, because there are definitely holes that we have with the K through 6 science curriculum. So some of the things that we're thinking about in the future really sort of fill some of those holes. I think this part of the art or my talk I've done before, so some of you might have seen this, but if you have new people, or there's people that are new to us, this is our sort of recipe. We're a big believer in sort of creating rules and creating a sort of a box, a rubric to be in. I'm a big fan of rules. If anyone's old enough to remember Mac Paint, the screen was 416 pixels wide, and that's because it was a 32-bit machine. And there were only 13 by 32 registers for data. So what you're seeing there is almost like this reflection of the restrictions that existed. You couldn't scroll because there was no memory for scrolling. So on mobile, a lot of times it feels like there's no restrictions, you know, because you have all this amazing stuff on mobile. And so we put them on ourselves. So our first restriction is our apps are quiet. We don't have background music in our apps. We think that music sort of provides this sort of artificial tempo for kids. So our apps are musical, but the music sort of is usually embedded within the app. If a character jumps around, it might make, you know, a note or a sound, but that's really determined by the rhythm that the kid is playing. It's not composed by us. I love quiet games. Myst was like something that blew me away when I was a kid, and the first thing I noticed about it was how quiet it was. And so lot of our apps, we aspire to that sort of mysteriousness, ability to like slow kids down. We always work with great artists. I think it's amazing how many app companies, especially kids app companies, don't work with really high quality artists. It's something that they sort of farm out to the end, or they don't really. If you look at the budgets, it's not a big part of their budget. I think that, you know, if you remember your favorite kids book, that you close your eyes and you can know what that cover is. You know what your favorite illustration is. I think apps can have that power if you have and work with the right artists. Like, you know, these were the kind of books that inspired me as a kid. I want images that are as powerful within our apps. We reveal ourselves slowly. So a big part of what we do is we play test a lot. We see sort of what kids like to do and what they want to do. But we want to make sure that the 10th time a kid plays and the 100th time and the 1000th time that they play, that there are different things happening. So part of the way we embed that is by using a lot of physics-based animations rather than pre-canned animations. That allows a certain realities to seep in. But then we hide a lot of Easter eggs in our apps. And you know, we have an amazingly long, kids play our apps often for over a year. We have some kids that play for multiple years. It's a lot of value for $3. And so we want to make sure that, you know, we have little things that only get triggered if you've played, you know, 100 times or 1,000 times, or little hidden pieces of the app. And kids always find them, and they always know them. Like, a lot of times the emails that we get are, you know, from some kid that's found something that, you know, took him months to figure out. And we love that. We always add a little touch of danger in our apps. So, you know, in the US, I'm sure around the world also, like, kids are more controlled than they ever have been in history. Like, they don't walk to school, they don't, you know, their lives are very constrained. And so in our apps, like, there's always something that puts kids a little off balance. And if I think about my favorite childhood books, there was always like an element of dangerousness. And a lot of kids these days don't really even get that in books. So in our books, in our apps, you know, we show things that are, you know, we show the dead shark, we show a forest catching on fire. You know, the human body vomits and can get very sick. You know, robots fail badly. And the danger is a lot of kids are attracted to that. That's how they're sort of trying to figure out the world, and sometimes like figuring out death. And you know, we think that's really important. We don't try to answer all the questions. We always leave kids with questions. This is something I talk about in every talk, and I've had this slide in every talk I've ever done. Since my kids were very young, they're much older than this now, they're 12 and 14. We always, before they go to bed, we do something called question time, where they can ask me any question, and I can ask them any question. We've been doing it since they were children, and you know, now they're asking me about girls and you know, how to deal with their friends vaping and stuff. But it's asking questions, I think, is one of the great things about parenthood. It's one of the great things about interacting with kids, and I think a lot of people just don't do it enough. They don't ask questions to see what kids really think, and they don't give them enough of a forum to really be able to express themselves freely. So I hope that our apps allow that to happen. We engineer for delight. That just means like details as far as I'm concerned. So again, going back to books, you know, if you know the Richard Scarry books, like there's this little character Bulba, and every one of these pages, it's like this little Easter egg that he has. where he is in this page, but he's in there somewhere. And if you experience this book with kids, you know that every single kid will ultimately find Goldbug, and they'll go to Goldbug on every page, and that kind of becomes the point of the book, that little detail. You know, I like books that have maps at the end that kind of explain what's going on. There's sort of that ability to kind of go beyond what you're supposed to do and give kids this whole extra, you know, layer of delightfulness is something that I think is super important. You know, I think one thing I always talk about is in the Human Body app, we found that kids always want to make the human body fart. And so, you know, initially we just had like a fart sound. And then we found that kids, like, it was funny, but they kind of wanted to make bigger farts and, like, you know, longer farts and little farts. And so we actually, like, did a little fart physics engine for sound so that, you know, when the kid swipes a certain way, it can let out like a really giant fart or a really small one. And to me, that's the kind of detail that kids respond to. We try to use powerful inspirations. Like every app that we do starts with people on the team sitting around, closing their eyes and talking about images and memories that inspired them. So and we create these crazy mood boards. So, you know, with the human body, you know, this hung over my grandmother's, my abuelita's bed. So she had this picture there, and obviously it had a big effect on me. You know, my grandmother was a super Catholic Mexican lady. I don't think that there's it's a state that the icon looks like that. You know, it's a powerful image to me, and we hope that that icon is powerful to you. And, you know, these are sort of other things that were in our mood boards that we look at. And again, each one is inspired by a specific memory or by, you know, in my case, often it's something that my kids did. You know, my kids love to play robot and dress up. And so, you know, we try to recreate that in app form. You know, I remember, you know, my kids discovered this, I don't know if you know this artist, but he creates these beautiful kinetic sculptures, and my kids just became obsessed with it. So we tried to make the robots in our robot app and in our new app, things that go bump, the little household creatures, they move a little bit like this, and they use some of the same physics. You know, we observe, you know, we look at how kids play a lot. So we have an open door policy in our office with kids. We have a library set up that's full of kids' books and iPads and, you know, fun games and stuff. And we work in a building with a karate studio downstairs, and there's a foster care center on the first floor, and kids always know that they can come up and play in the office. And in Playtest, I think the hard thing about Playtest is oftentimes it's a bunch of adults with like clipboards sitting around like 3 kids. And you don't learn that much there. I mean, you learn some things. You learn if something's totally not working. But if you really kind of want to see how things work over time, you have to have like the magic iPad that has everything on it, and see if they go back to your stuff, you know, when they have the best of the best on there. And just watching how kids play, watching how they talk to each other, watching, you know, what they're doing, I think is super important in terms of just getting the feel of the apps right. I think it's also really important to talk to kids about their experience and like sort of understand what they're experiencing emotionally. They feel big emotions oftentimes, and often about the content that you're putting on the screens. And we forget how like big and mysterious the world can be for kids. This was, you know, my kid Gabrielle, he was a swamp monster here. And you know, play is serious too. It's fun, but it's also very serious, and it's part of the way that they're sort of creating the world. And then finally, I think as our recipe, I think it's really important to put yourself in the proper place. You know, we as a brand, I think too often brands put themselves at the center, and it's kind of all about what the brand is. And you know, we try to you know, put ourselves sort of on the edge, and kids are always in the middle. I think the title of this talk is about finding meaning, and obviously, like, we care a lot about what we do, but the thing that we often struggle with is how do we create meaningful experiences for kids. And you know, I think that starts with us sort of thinking about what's meaningful for us. You know, play is meaningful. Like, any parent, when you've seen a kid like really involved in play, really immersed, that's meaningful. They're really playing, and they're not, you know, just sort of following a set of instructions, and they're sort of creating something out of that's sort of platonic ideal, if you're a parent, of watching a kid sort of create their own little world. I think, you know, learning and then understanding is really important. Like, this is this great book called Where Children Sleep, and it has a picture of a kid that shows where they sleep. And I remember going through this book with my kids. It's in our office. It gets picked up often by kids. And they're just fascinated. Like, it instantly ties them to, you know, these kids and their lives, and they go through and they study the pictures. And there's just a lot of learning and understanding that can come out of that. So there's real meaning in that too, in the type of learning that leads to understanding. I think competition, failure is important. My two kids, these are them now, they're a little older, but they're constantly competing with each other. I forget what game this was that was there, but it almost ended in tears. But I think, you know, there's a lot of meaning in competition, in doing something, failing, trying again to win, and you know, that's something that for a lot of kids is a big driver in their lives through sports and through just school. You know, there's a lot of competition baked in, and a lot of kids find meaning out of that. I think something a lot of people don't talk about is just beauty. Like, there's a lot of meaning in beauty. I was asking my kids the other day about sort of what are their favorite memories. And one kid said, well, you know, we went to, there was one time we just sort of took this impromptu road trip and decided to drive across country. And we were driving through the desert, and there was a sunset in the rearview mirror, and he just took this blurry picture on his cell phone. And he said he goes back to it sometimes because he liked that feeling of what it was like in the desert with the setting sun. You know, we live in New York City, so that was like this beautiful experience for them. You know, beauty's underrated, and I think it's very meaningful for many kids. And then there's just experience. Like my older city kid this summer did this hiking trip called Knowles, where they're out in the woods for a couple of weeks, you know, no technology at all. They carry their own backpacks, and he came back kind of a changed person. You know, he's a very digital kid. He's very much focused on his phone, and not having that for a month really kind of made him sort of rejigger and rethink his priorities. And part of that was the connection he had with the other kids. Like, there are a lot of kids that live in this world and aren't connected with other kids so much, and so like creating those connections, I think, is really important. And I think if you go back to this first slide and you look at all these things, maybe with the exception of Baby Shark, which I totally understand, you know, each of these platforms is giving meaning for these kids. I mean, there are a lot of kids that, you know, when they talk about you know, they'll reminisce about when they were young in Minecraft and they were playing hide and go seek. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on TikTok that's really interesting. Like this video is you know, young black girl talking about having crushes on white boys and not having crushes on I mean, there's race, there's gender stuff happening. There's a lot of things that are big issues that are being discussed there. This is my son's Instagram. He loves origami. He's like a very talented origamist. Like he finds meaning in sort of creating these things and having this little community of crazy origami people like follow him and vice versa and learn from each other. So I think a lot of times it's easy to look at these platforms and especially I've heard people dismiss Snapchat and TikTok, but there's a lot of meaning that kids are getting out of these things. For us, I'm going to go through 3 of our apps and talk about sort of how we find meaning in them and how kids have found it. So one of our apps, Plants, it was our second app. It's a sophomore app in many ways. And it's one that like adults rarely understand. The actual first inspiration for the Plants was this. I don't know if anyone remembers the time machine. Yeah. But there was this scene where, he would pass through time would move really quickly. The sun would shoot through the sky, and that's kind of where we started. And Plants is this app about biomes. We have a couple of biomes in there. There's a desert and a deciduous forest and the pampas in Argentina. And down here you have this little time slide. And kids can touch it and they can make time move. And the sun shoots through the sky, just like in the time machine. And you can go through the seasons. And there are a lot of kids that'll just do that. They'll just sit there and make the years go by and watch the animals go. But then, then kids sort of get interested in what's going on, and they realize that they can touch the clouds and they can cause rain. And if they rub the clouds together, they can spark lightning. When lightning strikes, sometimes there are forest fires, and the forest fires burn up the forest. This is an image that, the more we tested it, like, the kids love it and they hate it. Like, they hate burning up the forest, but then they burn it over and over again. Because, at the end, after the forest is burned, it starts to grow back. And then there's like a whole new cycle that happens. And it's a really simple thing. But you wouldn't believe like the play times in this app. Like, kids play this app for hours and hours at a time, often, and for long periods. And when we talk to kids about this app, they will talk about it as if they are in the forest. They'll say, well, when I was in the forest, I saw a deer, and there was this rabbit, and we have the slider, you can see sort of the rabbit hole go underground, this rabbit went underground, but then, then this fire started and burned down the forest and grew back. We have parents tell us that their kids sometimes talk to them about these experiences that they've had in places that they've never been, where they were in the desert. And it comes from the app. So for me, I feel like we've done our job. Like we've created this sort of a bit of meaning for these kids. The next app we're going to talk about is Me. So Me started with this. So my son Gabriel came home and they do this exercise in school. It's a map of the heart. Basically, you have a heart and you have to sort of subdivide it into things that are important for you. I was very proud to get a big swatch, and my wife was very unhappy that she had a small one. And I almost beat water slides in vacation. But the first idea with this app was, like, what could we create a map of the heart and have kids sort of play with it, manipulate it, and interact with one. And we did that. but we found that once kids did it, they were sort of done. Like they would do it once, and then it was just done. And so then, you know, somebody brought up this book. You know, if you're sort of my age, every kid had this book. It's my book about me, takes a picture of it. It's a super interactive book. You count the number of steps in your house, and you sort of catalog your world. And we thought, well, this is an interesting idea, but like, what's the 2019 version of this? And maybe it's, you're not just cataloging your world, but you're also like telling stories about those things. And so, you know, I always go back to, this is my second grade class, in the blue. And then, you know, I look at my kids' classes, and the question is, like, could we create something where each kid in that class can create an avatar of themselves and they represent themselves like relatively accurately? And then from there, like, could we start to create a map? Like, for each person in this map, they say, these are my parents, you know, this is my friend, and we ask them questions. And so we have a couple of hundred questions in here, and we ask, you know, what's my favorite thing about this person? What's, you know, something that makes me sad? What's something that makes me happy? What's something that upsets me about this person? And, you know, little by little, and kids can answer either by writing something or they can record. You know, we ask about emotions, we have little avatars, this is angry or sad. And eventually they create these like sort of crazy looking little mind maps, but each of these is also attached to all these questions that they can access later on. So they're creating this like map of their kind of emotional world. And teachers really, really like love this app, because in a classroom, you know, kids often don't know much about other kids' stories. And so, you know, when they sort of will map out their families, a lot of times their family maps look very different. The things that are important to them look very different. One of the questions we ask is, what's something I wish I could tell someone but I've never told somebody? And, you know, a lot of teachers tell us, you know, heartbreaking stories about, you know, there's one little girl that said that she told her teacher that she wished she could tell her that she sometimes is hungry because they don't, her family like didn't buy they had free lunch, but her mother didn't want her to buy free lunch because they were ashamed. So there's a lot of like interesting things that come out of this. And then a lot of times it's kids just talking about their friends and how much they love their friends, which is something that they rarely articulate. So, you know, I think there's a lot of meaning embedded in that app. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is our newest app, it's Things That Go Bump. It's part of Apple Arcade. So Apple Arcade, if you don't know, is Apple's new subscription service. They have only 100 developers are part of it, and it's creating games, like games, multiplayer games. And so they came to us and they asked us if, you know, if we wanted to pitch, participate. And we were sort of torn because, you know, we don't make games. And so our question was, could we make something that sort of embedded some of the Tinybop values in a game that is also meant not just for younger kids, but for older kids as well. And so where we started, we gave ourselves like a week to just internally create a little demo. And the first thing that we thought of was that it's a robot world. The robots have taken over. We don't know why the humans are gone. But they discover like these human games that existed. And so, you know, the robot discovers a tetherball, and, you know, trying to play tetherball. And, you know, eventually, you know, it's multiplayer, so you're playing versus each other, and they're playing sort of robot-wise, tug of war. etc. We were using artwork from our other apps, so it was easy to like create this little demo. But we felt it was like, ultimately we felt this idea was like kind of derivative of other stuff that we had done, and it maybe didn't feel Tinybop-y enough. So then we thought, well, what if, instead of robots, what if it were, you know, what if it were just like things around the house, like little spool of thread, you know, like one of those little, I forget what they're called, those little games, fidget spinner. And one of those, like, it was this little battle between these, you know, these things that you find around the house. And, you know, we liked this idea more, but it didn't really feel cohesive enough for us. But we liked that idea. We had very little time. So we got this, the sort of the question to make, like, were we going to participate in this, I think in May. And it was going to launch in September. And normally our apps are like 6 to 8 month extravaganzas. So we just instantly started having to work. So we decided to like go to artists, create a house, play around with, you know, different ways in which you could have like household objects, you know, in the house. How would they, you know, look sort of coming to life? And we went through a bunch of different artists and iterations. And eventually we found, you know, this artist that we really liked that named Adrian Fernandez. He's German. And he just had this sort of style that felt right for us. And as we were thinking about this and thinking about objects, I've always been fascinated with Japanese mythology. And Japanese have this mythology about objects. They have these little spirits that live inside. So we came up with a storyline that's not really articulated in the game, but it's this idea that there are these spirits that they're in the woods and they come into this house and they start to inhabit these objects and they sort of play. They make mischief, like cat style. This is where we ended up with our art style. And so the more we sort of added this story that we understood, even though we're not expressively talking about it in the game, the more we felt that we had something that was interesting. You know, so we created this idea of spirits, and we have these little things that are just made from everyday things around the house, and then we have this idea of house spirits that are defending the house. You know, the toilet has its own spirit. It's very scary. And as we started putting this together and playtesting, we found that kids were just having a blast. Like in the game, kids go in and you have to find a body and find legs and arms, and you can reconfigure. And so it had a little bit of that sort of construction set thing that we like, along with some sort of magical storytelling that we haven't really done before. And so this is the trailer, and let's see what you think. And so this launched a few weeks ago on Apple Arcade. We can't really talk about sort of how it's gone. Apple doesn't allow us to, but I will say that they made a deal that developers are happy with. It's a huge platform, and what we found is it's bringing people to our other titles. And the way that we're structuring this game is that we started with 3 rooms at the house, and then every 2 months we're releasing new rooms that sort of add a lot of things. So this is the nursery that is going to be released later this month. In the first levels of the house, you're just basically finding these different parts, putting together your little creature. and then battling against other players, usually multiplayer. In this one, you can not only do that, but there's like a dollhouse version of the whole house that you can go into, and then you become a giant version of yourself. There's a helpful stork that comes along. There's actually a baby sleeping in the crib that you don't want to wake up. And so this game is, I think, going to be really fun for us and very different than anything we've done. This is another feature level. And what I like about it is that we don't tell the story of what's happening. We have our version of it, but every time we talk to kids about what's going on in there, they have totally different sort of ideas about what's going on. And for me, if we can do that within the framework of a traditional game, like that works for me in terms of how we're providing meaning to people. What's next for Tinybop? We're very interested in creating film, and we've been pitching both TV series and podcasts that follow the lives of kids around the world. This is sort of a dream project for me. Those are my photographs of like kids in Tibet, but basically the idea is that we're going through a day in the life of kids. We're seeing what they eat, where they sleep, just like that book, Where Kids Sleep. But we're doing it dramatically over the course of one day. And we're about to shoot our first version of this, and if it goes well, we'll be pitching it to all the various streaming companies. Things that go bump, the game title. We are also pitching an anime series based on Things That Go Bump. That pitch seems to be also going very well, so that's another sort of dream to do that. I come out of the film industry, so I'm a little bit familiar with how it works out there. With Tinybop itself, with our apps, the next app that we're working on is Light and Color. It sounds like a fairly esoteric title, but it's like one of my favorites. I think we're going to make it really beautiful. And then with Tinybop Schools, our goal there is to work with companies that already have networks of schools. So I don't think we're allowed to announce it yet, but we've signed our first pretty major partnership with a school system that has thousands of schools, and that will sort of get Tinybop into schools as well. So we have a busy year, and for us, a lot of it has been about sort of moving outside the App Store, sort of having this painful process of figuring out sort of where our IP is and where it's valuable, and going out to all these other sort of expressions of the brand. But it's been definitely a hard year, but also a lot of fun and a lot of new stuff coming down the pike. Feel free to reach out and say hello. I can always or be found at Tinybop. I'm also the Mexican, all social media, basically. So that's my talk.
Thank you.